Ladies and gentlemen, dear fleet colleagues, welcome to this webinar of the IFMI, the International Fleet Managers Institute. My name is Steven Schroefs, Chief Editor of Fleet Europe, and we are really happy that you can all join this first IFMI webinar of the year on efficiency in fuel management. The IFMI stands for International Fleet Managers Institute. It is the dedicated training and expertise sharing platform for international fleet managers only. And the IFMI also stimulates forward action and it triggers innovative thinking in car fleet management. Last but not least, the IFMI focuses on best practice sharing and interaction. Also in this webinar, you will have the opportunity to learn from a recognized fleet peer, and at the end of the webinar, there is the possibility to ask your questions to our experts in a lively Q&A session. But first, a little explanation of the topic of today: efficiency in fuel management. The IFMI partners believe it is the right time to address the topic in our fleet community, as different elements are encouraging thinking about the issue. Fuel cost typically represents 25 to 30% of a vehicle fleet's total cost of ownership, at least in the more mature markets like Western Europe. And it can be as low as 10 to 15% of your TCO in Eastern Europe and other markets where fuel is far more cheaper. And although since the middle of 2014 oil prices have dropped by almost half, they are currently hovering at around $50 a barrel, attention is still requested. Of course, this generates all nice fuel cost savings for you, and we all know that OEMs are also launching more and more fuel-friendly and low-emission vehicles on the market, but the IFMI underlines there is no reason at all to pay less attention to dedicated fuel management, as fuel price is a volatile element, and what comes down will probably go up again. And even if fuel prices will stay down, well, a good and dedicated fuel management that leads to less fuel consumption on top of lower fuel prices is a double positive impact. So, yes, you are in the right webinar today. In this webinar, you will learn how to address fuel management in a consistent way based on the expertise of our partners, followed by a case study of Xerox. The experts that are going to take you on the path of efficient fuel management today are Mr. Mark van Eck of ALD International and Thor Konings of Athlon Car Lease. They will give a more holistic insight in fuel management. And afterwards, no one less than Brian Knight of Xerox Limited will shine a light on the way his company is paying attention to fuel management, and he will explain where possible cost savings are possible, yes, where you can make them. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's time now for first part of this webinar, and I'm glad to give the webinar floor to Mark van Eck of ALD International. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everybody. And if we move on to the next slide, Stephen. Okay, and the question arises, if we ask the question, why is efficiency in fuel management important? I think that we need to understand the finite nature of oil resources. Oil resources are not around forever. There comes a time when it comes to an end, and as a result, we have to deal with issues of supply and demand, which obviously affect the oil price. And we'll talk a bit more about that a bit later on. So as a result of the fluctuations, the volatility in oil prices that we've been seeing, this has led to an even greater awareness of costs with regards to the fuel cost component. And I think also as we are in an environment of cost saving, it's also a very challenging component to get to grips with, because it's very difficult to influence as there are so many outside factors. And as was mentioned earlier on, the TCO impact, the total cost of ownership impact with regards to fuel can be 25 to 30% in the more mature markets, and that makes it a significant cost component. The fuel cost per car, well, depending on markets where you are, but we work on an average of about 2,600 euros based on 30,000 kilometers per year per car. This is quite a spend, certainly if you were to extrapolate this times your running fleet size. So therefore, certainly an area worth looking into. But this can also be important when you're looking at your company's environmental impact and their strategy. So looking at perhaps reducing your CO2 footprint, and to do that, amongst other areas to be investigated and to be dealt with, is of course the fuel cost component. Therefore, with cost control and these reduction programs in place, looking at efficient fuel management, it is absolutely key in not only getting to grips with this cost spend, but also finding ways to control and reduce on an ongoing basis. And also, not to be misunderstood, is also the fact that there's a significant benefit in kind impact on the driver. So in high taxation countries, the drivers actually have quite an influence in the vehicles which they choose within their car policy. So they will choose vehicles which are generally more fuel efficient to be able to benefit from a lower benefit in kind taxation. Let's move on to the next subject, and I'll hand over the next slide. I'll hand over to Tor Konings.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. And good morning to you all. So given this background, let's have a closer look at the circumstances today and the challenges for you as a fleet manager. On the one hand, there is an increasing need to control your cost. And on the other hand, fuel cost, like I said before, is the most volatile TCO component, which is constantly fluctuating and very difficult to predict or to control. Fuel consumption is included in vehicle selection criteria more and more, and as such, it is an important element of the total cost of the car. And we're all aware of the significant impact of driver usage on the fuel cost, and we already have, or we are looking for, programs to keep this under control. And supplier management, you work directly or indirectly with several oil companies. Their coverage, unfortunately, is suboptimal. The defragmented offering across Europe is something we have to consider and accept. Let me give you two examples. In France, it is almost inevitable to work without Total, whereas in Spain, Repsol has the best nationwide coverage. So this requires regional or even country-specific partnerships with suppliers who are best in class. Once selected, you can look for clustering options in order to optimize your supplier base. And if we move to reporting, another challenge, in order to manage your drivers, your supplier, and your cost, you need data, or even better, you need information to measure and monitor. Let's not forget your internal stakeholders, who typically ask for more reports and in further detail. Most suppliers can deliver raw data files. However, creating alignment can be a real challenge, especially with multiple suppliers using multiple formats in multiple countries. So in order to capture your spend, you need to consolidate the inputs either yourself or depend on external support, for instance, your leasing company. Like said before by Stephen as well, the oil prices are extremely volatile. Global supply and demand are impacted by political, economical crises, the exchange rate fluctuations, the threat of war, natural disaster, accidents, incidents, and as a result, mid-2014, we've seen the oil price drop significantly to around $30 a barrel. This has a massive impact on your fuel spend. In the business case later today, explained in detail by Brian Knight, we will further elaborate on this. So nobody can really tell what the trend and expectations are. However, we are expected to anticipate on future trends. And you are expected to manage the expectations of the internal stakeholders in your company. Now let's have a look at technological advancements. optimization of the ICE, the internal combustion engine technology. So manufacturers and their suppliers are addressing this to find more sustainable solutions. For an example, the stop-start technology, the improvements in the weight of the car, in the aerodynamics of the car, and the increased fuel efficiency are resulting in lower CO2 emissions. In recent years, all OEMs have advanced in hybrid technology, whether with petrol cars and diesel cars. They developed full electric cars, and even hydrogen powertrains are now more and more upcoming. The OEMs are more or less impacted, their demand for their cars is impacted by the fluctuating oil and fuel prices. Increased car connectivity, so real-time traffic information allows drivers to optimize their routing, and navigation technology is advancing. And to close off with new developments is, of course, the self-driving vehicles that we hear more and more about in the news. Not far from now, human element will be limited as vehicles will drive more independently. And while there's still a few challenges in legislative and safety areas, that technology is being developed as we speak. Perhaps said enough about why it is important to increase efficiency in fuel management and what the challenges for you as a fleet manager are. Now let's have a look at what lease companies can do for you. I'd like to hand over to Mark again.
Thank you, Tor. Yes, when looking indeed what lease companies can do for you as a fleet manager, the fact of the matter is we can offer consultancy and advice. We have a lot of information at our disposal. We have the expertise in-house. We have knowledge centers whereby we have detailed information. We know what works in each individual market, and we can advise exactly what is possible and what is not possible. We can give an idea of costing as well. And the example given previously by Tor, that for example, Total would be a good choice in France, Repsol a good one in Spain. The same applies to all the other markets, of course. There is no one ideal or one perfect supplier. The idea of the right footprint is, of course, geographical footprint is absolutely key, but it needs to have the right coverage, it needs to have the right address the mobility concerns of your drivers. So what's important is then to actually look at this on a country-by-country basis. And then looking at country by country, and then possibly looking where you can actually combine it or cluster it to make it a more regional approach. And based on that approach, you can then decide how you enter into negotiations with the relevant fuel companies. But coming back to what the leasing companies can do, they've got the knowledge, they can provide the guidance which you may need if you go down this road to investigate this. Also, quite key is looking at your car policy from time to time. If anything, it needs to be done more often. Reason is, if you're looking with regards to fuel, the fuel choice, because the OEM advice can be made and which manufacturers to work with. We can run the TCO selection, determining which vehicle makes most sense for you, and of course, which fuel type. But as prices, oil prices are volatile, and therefore the price at the pump keep changing, it also means that the turnaround point between diesel, petrol, hybrid, or alternative powertrains also shifts from time to time. And therefore, what makes sense for your car policy right now might become more expensive for you later on. So absolutely key to keep reviewing this on a regular basis. So I mentioned previously that negotiations is something where leasing companies can provide support in. We can help analyze the proposals you receive from oil companies, and we can ensure by providing the right advice, saying which companies make sense depending on your driver's needs. So depending where they operate the vehicles, we can then advise if these are the right oil companies or right fuel card providers to work with. Reporting has been touched on before, but is absolutely key. It's important to have the right level of reporting and to make sure this is available. So the source is, of course, absolutely essential. It can come either from the fuel card providers or it can come by the leasing companies. Either way, this needs to be consolidated, and you need to have this view at a fleet level as well as at a driver level. At a driver level, you need to be able to manage your fleet. You need to control by exception reporting, and of course at a fleet level for your forecasting to see which way your costs are going with regards to fuel. Other areas of making it more tangible is to look into eco training, also telematics, perhaps even online driver trainings to create an awareness, an ongoing awareness in a sustained way, whereby drivers realize that what they're doing, the way they drive, impacts costs. It has a very, very direct correlation. And by having that awareness, that'll hopefully reduce the amount of fuel used. So have a more efficient fuel consumption. So that is absolutely key. And also to get that commitment from the drivers, because driver behavior is a very challenging area to have to deal with, but it is one which can actually reduce cost in the short term. If we move to the next slide, if we look at where we are right now, so what are the next steps and how to proceed? We would suggest that now is indeed the time to act. Having a proactive approach to dealing with your fuel spend is absolutely essential. It's a question of making hay while the sun shines. The oil prices are low right now, and you can benefit from that. So we suggest contact your lease company, make use of the knowledge they have, make use of the expertise they have, and that can provide the consultancy, which can provide added value when you're looking at fuel within your fleet. So at this point, we would also say then, focus on your long-term strategy. We've seen a volatility of oil prices. At the beginning of the year, the price even went as low as $46 a barrel with Brent crude. In May already, and we've just gone into May, we're already moving towards $70 a barrel. So it's changing. But we say stay close to your long-term strategy. Don't keep adapting it. Stay true to your course. And finally, we would say, whilst cheap fuel costs available, enjoy it, because it won't last forever. So make the most of it while you can. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Toch, for this really comprehensive analysis and your insights in efficient fuel management. For the attendees, of course, if you have questions for our speakers, please send them by using the chat function so that we can ask also your questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Okay, we will now go to the exciting part of today. I can imagine that you want to hear from a fleet peer, and we have found one who has great knowledge on fleet management. It's Mr. Brian Knight from Xerox, and Brian, he will explain us what has been done at Xerox in terms of efficient fuel management and all the elements impacting the fuel management strategy and how he has reduced, let's say, the fuel costs. So I will now give the webinar floor to Brian so that he can start his case study presentation. Brian, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I quickly would like to just give a brief statement on Xerox and what we're about. Xerox, for example, is more than a photocopier company. So if you can move the slide forward, please, Stephen. One of the things, we've been in business now for half a century. Xerox, as you're most aware, is a leader in document technology and services. So we continue to build on that technology and the innovation from that. But one of the things that may surprise many people is we're now world leading in business processes as well as document management. And we offer global services from services such as claims reimbursement, automated toll transactions, for example, to customer care centers, and also HR benefits management. You can see from the three numbers there, key numbers, we are 20 billion in annual revenue. We have some 140,000 employees, and we serve clients in some 180 countries. So moving on, as an international fleet manager, I take both the strategic and operational approach to fuel management. And the team has been working together to bring those two key aspects, strategy, and as was said earlier, a strategy which is long-term and its influence on TCO. But let's start by the positioning of our fleet profile and our policy. So within Xerox fleet, can you come back, Stephen? On the Xerox fleet profile, the executives are 23% of the fleet, sales are 24%, that's some 1,600 vehicles. Service is the largest proportion, which is 53%, 1,800 vehicles. I'll come back to that later on in the presentation. What is key here, as many of you find, we have executives which are mainly personal use, sales, which of course are job cards, and with the engineer service side, we have specific requirements regarding usability and safety. The total fleet, some 3,400 vehicles. the job cards amount to 78%, and you can see the largest fleets are in France and GB from the graph, and then the other part of it splits into 7 countries between 100 and 400 vehicles, and a further 6 between 50 and 100. So turning to the next slide. As has been said, volatility, very, very difficult for us to get a control on this sort of thing. And the graphs, the track both on the right-hand side, which I want to just spend a bit of time on, shows the high level of variability we've had since 2006 as an average for the year through to 2015 across those countries I've selected. That is a very difficult price call to make. Nevertheless, at local level, with the fleet managers, we do have tacticals. We have tactical initiatives on rebates, bonuses with the fuel brands. And of course, as I said earlier, we do link with the leasing companies to, again, get additional information. The left-hand side of the chart is quite interesting because when we break down the average, and if you can follow France, for example, in the table, the lowest price that occurred in that trend from 2006 to 2015 was €1.01, and the highest was €1.55. That's a 50% variation. Again, it demonstrates the difficulty of how do you manage it. And over the whole period, that's representing an 11% increase for France, again from 2006 to 2015. Now the implications, if I turn to the next slide, from our point of view, if we look at our consumption or usage, this pie chart demonstrates quite clearly where we've got the largest proportion of fuel consumption is within 5 countries, 60% of the fuel costs. So when we take the whole of the fleet, the 3,500 vehicles, we're consuming some 7 million litres, 6.55 million litres. That has an expense to us of 8.5 million euros. That's 20% of our expenditure. And so clearly we have to say, well, tacticals help, but we really need a strategy that is sustainable and can move forward and give us the cost savings that we are under challenge to achieve by influencing the TCO on fuel costs. I'll move to the next slide. Our strategy is developed for over typically a 5-year period. We focus on the next 3 years, but we do develop a strategy over 5 years. And we do that by involving our HR stakeholders and our finance stakeholders. And we've had an objective over the last 5 years, 5 to 6 years, to both inform them and use policy to manage costs, balanced with the HR requirements to provide fuel-efficient vehicles for the employee groups. And as you can see, during last year, in fact, it started in 2013, we made a call to move from 7 preferred OEMs to 2 OEMs. We made a decision, in policy terms, to move to 1 OEM for executive and sales with 4 brand choices, and to 1 OEM for service engineers with 1 standard model. In fact, the success of the service engineer approach, which we implemented some 4 years ago, led to the decision to do something similar for the executive and sales on the basis of the procurement benefits that we've identified there. We leverage the leasing costs, the synergy from maintenance costs and support, the business process simplification, which helps us reduce, if you like, the immense need for administration, which existed previously within our fleet management processes. The key to us, though, was effective supplier relationship. Without a good relationship with both the leasing companies and the OEMs, we would not have moved forward in the way we have done with this direction. Well, what is it about? It's about management of the emissions to reduce CO2 taxation, which has been talked about, both in terms of to the company and to the employee. But the key direction, the objective we want to achieve, is over a sustained period, a 20% reduction using fuel as an efficiency factor with fuel-efficient engines to impact on the TCO costs. So moving to the next slide, a key decision to this was a decision to move from directional feeding on CO2 and the behavior regarding environmental view of what we want to do, to introducing a clear top-stop for each group. So executives is 120 grams, sales is 110, and the service engineers is 90 grams. That will give us quite an improvement on the performance we have to date, which again, you'll see that as it comes through in the later slides. But as we all know, lower CO2 gives us lower fuel consumption, but it's not without its own environmental considerations. And let's pause there a moment just to ensure that you understand we have a diesel fleet, and if you're being conscious of both public and government concern of late, there's a lot of issues concerning particulates and the pollution that diesel engines are putting out into the environment. So now it's timely for us probably to relook at our strategy on how we go forward again for the next 3 years. Where we are now, the policy is fully implemented. That's the 2 OEMs, the top stops for these employee groups across 15 countries. That was completed in Q3 last year. But as I said, it wasn't without its challenges. I've used the word difficulties here. There were tough negotiations. I would say with 2 groups, basically, it's hitting the first 2 bullets really. Employees perhaps struggled with the wiseness of going down this route, how it would affect them. The workers' councils were resistant in a number of countries. But again, we put the emphasis on sustainability and the environment, and the importance for us to be what we believe we are, is a company that considers the environment in everything we produce in technology. So therefore, we should adapt that with regard to the types of fleets and buildings we have. As an indicator of some of the more specific problems, you can see how we struggle with MPVs. France likes its large people carriers, and we had difficulty getting an appropriate CO2 vehicle to meet that. And similarly, we probably were a bit too harsh when it came to automatic cars, because at the time we implemented, the engines coming through with the automatic weren't quite where we wanted them to be. However, it's been addressed now. On the next slide, I focus on the service vehicles, and here it demonstrates the consistency which follows our view of the evolution of the engine and following the CO2 down with the improvements in the engine technology. And what we typically do here is a benchmark every year and an RFP every 2 years. If in that benchmarking we find there are the market is moving away from the model we're using, i.e. it's improving, then in the RFP we then start to look for those alternative vehicles that will meet both our fuel efficiency requirement, our CO2 reduction, and of course the business need, which is principally on capacity. And you can see this technology approach, following the evolution, has brought us a reduction from the baseline of 30% of our fuel consumption. There's a bit of rounding up here with the numbers, but it's equivalent to also a 30% plus CO2 reduction. And then those round numbers, that's effectively 600 litres of diesel per car per year on a 40,000 kilometre annual mileage. And that represents, for every 100 vehicles, a 78,000 euros per year. Now, that's 1.4 million euros over that period. So I move on to the next slide. I wish to demonstrate, again, the influence on the TCO. So if you take 2008, when we had a 4.8 litre engine per 100 kilometres, our fuel consumption within the TCO, remember this is principally the job car side, the 53% of the fleet, it was 40% of the TCO. With us following the evolution and being prepared to make changes with the right engine, with the right vehicle requirement at the time, we've now got our fuel component of the TCO in France down to 24%, UK 25%, and Italy 31%. A clear illustration that this particular strategy has delivered what Xerox set out to achieve. And to cap that off, if we move to the next slide, we track CO2 emissions on a quarterly basis. And here we have the information we're tracking from 2006, France, UK, and Netherlands as an illustration. And you can see that trend has been remotely coming down as we've been following the technology trend for lower CO2, such that in this example, we've got Q1 2,662 grams, reducing in Q4 over a period of time to 113 grams. And that compiles all employee groups. I said a moment ago that you cannot do it alone from strategy. A strategy has to be implemented, and that strategy has the support of our operational teams. We have a fleet manager, purchasing manager in those countries, and they assist us with the implementation of the direction. And they particularly have been focusing on fuel management, using fuel cards, and it is essential for success that they support the employees. And in that regard, they will produce reports. Those reports will provide information, if you like, on the performance of the vehicle. They'll also try and provide information on driver behaviors. One of the emphases there is to look at the highest, from a Pareto point of view, the best and the worst vehicle performances. Regular communication occurs through the majority of the leasing companies to the drivers and or the line managers. And the local fleet initiatives you can see are on communications, regular servicing with regular checks on tyres and the inflation of the tyres, and selective driver training where considered appropriate. One of the concerns, though, we have, the empty with fuel cards is very administrative demanding, and the reporting with the feedback is retrospective, not necessarily accurate. So we have a position which we think is there or thereabouts, but our next big step that we're about to take and have implemented on the next slide is GPS and telematics. So all our service cars last year, and by the way, this strategy has taken 4 years to evolve to the point of implementation, working closely with HR to ensure we had a communication pack that went to all the senior management, and that senior management could then understand the challenge which they have to take through the workers' councils. That took us 12 months. We started the program in October, November 2013 and completed it with plants in progress this year. And of course, now we can actually look factually at driver behavior and also the vehicle performance. We have to decide still how we talk to the teams, and maybe within the teams, the individuals talk to themselves regarding how they can continue to look at improving fuel performance, dealing with excessive speeding, dealing with braking acceleration. One of the key things we've got, though, is now the ability to split business and personal mileage. That is really an essential piece of information. The other thing, which is really caught up now, is that the drivers can interactively see what they're doing on an hour-by-hour, half-daily basis, daily. They are in control, if you like, of how they should be behaving. We now put the emphasis on safety and safety awareness. Within the groups, we say Xerox values safety, it values the environment, and that's having a far greater impact in the change of culture than simply providing the reports and the monitoring. I talked about the limitations earlier, but I'd like to close as follows on the final slide. Good fuel management requires collaboration. I've talked about there being a strategy. I've talked about there being an operational structure which has to support you and deliver local initiatives. And as you can see here, we've got HR, finance, and the driver community. We have to be aligned with the business operation. But without it, we wouldn't be successful without also using the supplier's knowledge, the supplier's support. So I talked earlier about supplier relationships, and we see that as really critical. So in essence, as I tie up on this, conclude on this slide, I hope I've been able to demonstrate in this case study the importance of managing fuel consumption, and its impact on the total cost of ownership from a strategic and operational viewpoint. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. I'm sure our webinar participants will have some questions for you, so they can use the chat function. We will now move on to the final part of this webinar, and that is the Q&A session. Our different experts, they will answer your questions, so please send them to us. And may I also ask you, when you send a question, to indicate to whom the question is addressed? That makes it a little bit more easier in the Q&A. I already have some questions, and I would like to start with the first one. It's for Brian. Brian, you mentioned, of course, and it was really clear that in terms of the CO2 emission savings that you realized, but in one of the slides you said, well, for the executives there is like a limit of 120 grams of CO2. How easy was it to convince them to stick to that 120 grams of CO2? Because with management and senior executives in the company, we also know that that's not always easy to convince them.
Yes, I can say that probably I wasn't Mr. Popular, but that's an aside. That's one of the difficulties that we will have to deal with. There's certain things you have to do. But coming to the point, when the policy was being evolved with the stakeholders, remember the stakeholders in this were both HR and finance. We are representing fleet through a procurement function, and we worked on this together. And the key thing to do right from the beginning was to talk to the leadership team, the senior leadership team within Xerox for Europe, and we explained what was doing. And the two stakeholders, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, and the European HR Director, put that presentation to the general managers. They had the opportunity of discussing it. They had the opportunity of realizing that we're doing this for what we thought were good sustainability, i.e. the cost aspect, but also environmental reasons. And that what we tried to set out right from the beginning was we don't want to reduce the quality and the specification of the vehicle. What we want to do is reduce the fuel consumption. And that, in most people's minds, makes sense until it comes to an individual, of course. But no, that's the way we communicated. We got their buy-in, and we moved forward from there. And 120 grams actually got reduced during that meeting, surprisingly. We had a higher level, and it was brought down by common consent. So that's the nature of the strength that was behind this particular strategy and the policy that came out from the strategy. Remembering this was 10 months in the making. It didn't just work out like something we did in 1 month. It took time.
Okay. Thank you very much. There is already a second question for you, Brian. And that question is, I think, related to something that you mentioned perhaps in the beginning, but certainly also at the end of your presentation. I think it was when you discussed a little bit the fuel cards and then afterwards the telematics tool, where you said that one of the big benefits is that you are now able to have the difference between the business mileage and the private mileage. And the question is, what kind of trends from there can you see in terms of associated fuel costs?
Let me see if I can try and respond in two ways. One, when we did all the planning and the business case study for the telematics, we were given a challenge to try and get the ROI, the return on investment on the fuel consumption and accurate business mileage. And what I can say is we achieved that. And I would say that just as an average figure, we found there was a variance between what was, if you like, manually reported by drivers to what the telematics was showing is something in about 10% or more. I won't say anything more than that. There was at least a 10% improvement as average. That was sufficiently across, shall we say, the service fleet of some 1,800 vehicles substantial. And that enabled us to cover the investment we made with the telematics. Now, you can only get a one-off saving. I mean, you can only go so far. That improvement, if you will, by putting telematics, has secured the behaviors that we wanted to get to, and now it's a matter of maintaining that using the telematics. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. A simple, little but important question also for Brian. Brian, what is the number of leasing companies Xerox works on a European level? With how many leasing companies do you work?
We have six leasing companies, and I like the earlier presentation where we look at things from a country and region point of view. One of the approaches we take is we won't force the operational aspect onto the countries. We allow them to make a call within reason. So we give them a boundary from an RFP of the leasing companies that we prefer, and then the country can decide how that particular leasing company best fits with their culture, the way they do their business processes, and that's why we have six. And I feel that there are some disadvantages, but in the round, that has been very successful again for us over the last 6 years by having that approach.
Okay. Another one for you, and then we can also ask the insights of our IFMI experts. Brian, how do you manage, if you are working with multiple leasing companies, how do you manage the data gathering if you are using, let's say, the multiple lessors with perhaps disparate or different systems?
That's an interesting question. I perhaps could turn that back onto the one or two of the leasing companies on the call, but no, I'll respond this way. It is an interesting challenge. If I give you some feedback on the global fleet, we look at the US, they have one leasing company. It makes a big difference, one platform, one set of reports. But as I said earlier, we would look at from a strategic point of view, first and foremost, in the sense here within my group. And so Tom and I would look at it, we would gather data, but only the data we need to ensure the strategy is sound and we're going in the right direction. So when it comes to the detail, that falls as a responsibility of the fleet and purchasing manager in the country. And so the platform to me is not critical. What's critical is that at local level, and it's essential in fact to our success, that they use those reports, and more importantly, we monitor that they have regular monthly meetings with the leasing providers. And provided they do that and they have a structured agenda, we have found again that has been a very successful approach for us in the way that Xerox has moved forward with these changes, both in strategy and policy.
Okay, thank you. I will now go to the IFMI partners. Mark, going forward with, let's say, the question and also the answer from Brian, in terms of if a client is working with multiple lessors, how can you assure that they have, let's say, a comprehensive insight and into the data that comes from the different suppliers? Can you support them?
Yes, Stephen, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's an interesting one in the fact that it ties in with what Brian said. How do you want to deal with this data? Are you looking at it high level, in other words, to assess what your current usage is, your current consumption, your current spend, or are you looking to manage it? And if you're trying to manage it operationally, so looking at exception reporting, etc., that typically gets done at a local level by the fleet manager in country itself. So when it comes to having more high-level data, it becomes more generic and is then easier to share. The fact of the matter is, realistically, that kind of information is not shared easily amongst different leasing providers. So you do need someone to keep and consolidate all that data. So what we typically see happening in the market is when this request is put forward, we will then, if we have the data, of course, provide it to our clients. The clients will then consolidate it. So we'll try and put together as much of a generic template as possible, collecting simply the high-level data. And that will then be a case of consolidating the sheets and then giving you the overall view which you need at a high level, so more strategic level than the operational. So important to look at the distinction there. So when we have the data, we can provide it and provide it in a way which is common for most of the suppliers so that there shouldn't be any issue in putting that all together.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. A question for Tor, perhaps, and then Brian, he can share his view. The question that I have for Tor is, Tor, when looking at the clients that you have, can you say that it's market practice to use the actual fuel consumption and CO2 information for the car selection, opposed to the OEM published data, knowing that, yes, there can be quite some differences in the theoretical and in the actual figures. What is a little bit the market practice that you see?
I would say, Stephen, that the market practice goes to the second option that you mentioned, realizing that it is that there is a deviation from what is a theoretical CO2 emission and compared to the realistic CO2 emission. However, in order to create some sort of consistency and alignment, it is more preferred to use that theoretical data rather than the realistic data, because it is more difficult to compare car for car, country for country with realistic numbers rather than the theoretical numbers. That is unfortunate, but it's the best perhaps available around.
Okay. Of course, we want to know now from Brian in what way that he uses, let's say, the actual data of the car manufacturers to do the vehicle selection, or are you also at the moment still focusing on the theoretical data?
Sorry, Stephen, the line broke up. Are you referring to myself here, Brian?
Yes, exactly, Brian. Did you understand?
Yeah, I'd like to pick. Yeah, I did. I heard the question. What I'd like to say, picking up on what was said a moment ago, as much as you cannot rely on, so you get this deviation on the manufacturer's stated performance, but remember that's gone through a methodology, so that is consistent as best they can do. But we also have the driver itself and the vehicle. Like a group of drivers have very different behaviors. They have very different stress points in the way that they also drive the vehicles. And not only that, the road conditions vary immensely. So you've got this big variable with the way the drivers and the road conditions, plus, if you like, this variable from the manufacturing statistics. What we do is we follow actual cost. Mm-hmm. So we know we've got the manufacturing statistic, but we actually follow actual cost. If you remember in one of the earlier slides, you saw the pie chart which said this is 2014 cost. And we track actuals that go through accounts payable on paid invoices. By the way, that's how we also capture CO2 as well. So we also have another trend, a little more difficult for us to keep up with, though, where we use the literage and the types of fuel, and we use an algorithm to convert that into energy and CO2. So we do it that way, but clearly we've got to keep it simple. I talked about us having a strategy. We do look at the feedback that you get from the various studies done on the vehicles, and typically, again, we would not necessarily select a vehicle that had a very wide performance reported over that MPG or the CO2 per, sorry, the MPG, the litres per 100 kilometres. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at. There is a variability. We manage it by managing actual costs.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are going to our final questions. The first one is for our IFMI partners, and I will start with Mark. Mark, you explained together with Toch a little bit, let's say, the approach that you can have when organizing, developing a good and efficient fuel management. If as an international fleet manager, you say you have to start, is there some kind of starting point, some kind of low-hanging fruit where you say, okay, that's perhaps the best thing to start with?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. When you're asking specifically about low-hanging fruit, so the easy point to start with, I would actually suggest by starting to create an awareness for the drivers. And this can be done fairly quickly by issuing a newsletter or an emailing to the drivers and stating indeed that fuel consumption, the usage thereof, it's all linked indeed, and by, for example, focusing on tanking away from the highways that can reduce costs, by using the car more efficiently, not having a heavy foot on the gas pedal, I suppose. So just creating awareness with tire pressures, loading the vehicle, all these points which are typically sent by a lot of leasing companies, in fact, to their drivers before the summer vacation period, to do this on a periodic basis. So that's something which can happen. It all sounds quite crazy, but also when looking at a TCO approach, we still see that there are customers out there which are not including fuel in a TCO. So that's certainly something which needs to be done because it clearly affects your TCO significantly. They also suggest to use the fuel data available. So really use the data available. The leasing companies prefer having the fuel card data in order to manage the vehicle, so we can manage in terms of services, etc. But there's also the management of the fleet for cost control. So deviation reporting, and then of course addressing it in such a way that I suppose deviant drivers or exceptional usage drivers can be addressed or approached on that subject. And I think once they realize that somebody's actually looking into their consumption, their fuel usage, that they will in fact decide to use their car in a more efficient manner. So I think that's the low-hanging fruit. And of course, then the next step is indeed embarking on a fuel card tender, which goes in a completely different direction, going to baseline setting. But that's not much the low-hanging fruit.
Okay, thank you. Going then to Tor, if there is, let's say, one tip that you have for international fleet managers in terms of optimizing their fuel management, what is it?
I would say reach out to your car leasing suppliers and ask for those programs that are available. In addition to what Mark was just explaining, creating that awareness is nowadays so much easier using modern technologies. All car leasing suppliers have advanced reporting tools and also communication systems with the drivers that allows you to make everybody aware of their impact on cost, on fuel cost. So reach out to your leasing company and study what is possible, what is available, and apply it.
Okay, thank you very much. The last question, of course, for our case study speaker, Mr. Brian Knight. A short one first, Brian. Is fleet management outsourced in Xerox or run internally? So do you have one central fleet system?
It's primarily outsourced. So if, for example, I talk to the countries, the resources where we may have had, shall we say, 2 or 3 people in the countries, that has gradually been reduced as we've outsourced much of the operational activities. But as I said earlier, it's very important that we do have a focal point in the country that's able to speak with the internal stakeholders, but also work within our team and network to ensure that our strategies and directions on fleet management, the fleet costs are kept, if you like, in check with our expectations and the targets we set.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Final question. You have a diesel fleet, let's say. When are you going to a more petrol fleet?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we can start to think about it in the future strategy, particularly with executives where we have a low mileage, where we have typically 40,000 kilometers as the annual mileage for the service vehicles, a little bit lower for sales, by the way. It's probably around about 37,000 kilometers a year. Of that, the high proportion of it is business activity. We still feel that, the facts still say, the facts, not what one feels and wants, that diesel and the continual advances of the diesel engine is the most fuel economic in cost terms. And I did address that there is a particular concern coming up, and we know the manufacturers are trying to deal with that and meet the Euro 6 and eventually the Euro 7 requirements. But I don't see us moving away from a mainly diesel strategy for job cars. Executives, I think we ought to start experimenting. Hybrids, we have 1 or 2, but they tend to be expensive. And we've also looked at electric, but I'm afraid the way people's lifestyles currently operate, the electric isn't a sole purpose vehicle. You'd have to have it backed up with a longer range vehicle.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. This was the IFMI webinar of today. As you know, or you don't know, but then you know it now, there will be a recorded version of the complete webinar, and we will show it in the upcoming days on the dedicated website of the IFMI, a website that where only corporate fleet managers can log into and can be a member of. So please afterwards go and take a look. You will also receive a little satisfaction survey after this webinar with a few questions. It helps us to optimize future webinars. So if you can fill it out, and that would be nice. And then the last question already discussed it a little bit. The next IFMI webinar will be organized on September 10, and there we will address the question diesel or petrol. What is the best fit for your fleet? So once again, thank you very much, and looking forward to welcoming you to our next IFMI webinar. Have a great day. Bye-bye.